Contempt. Rudy Giuliani found in contempt of court for the second time this week. On Monday, Rudy Giuliani found in contempt for failing to comply with orders to turn over his property to those election workers who won a $150 million judgment against America's mayor after he repeatedly defamed them by claiming they stuffed ballots for Joe Biden during the 2020 presidential election. That was in New York, in a courtroom on Monday. Yesterday, in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., where this defamation trial originated, Giuliani found in contempt yet again, this time for failing to obey a court order to stop defaming these two women. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell ruling that as recently as November of last year, Rudy Giuliani accused these Georgia election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, of counting Biden ballots 4 times each while manipulating the election machines. This despite a 2023 agreement that Rudy signed, where he promised to stop repeating these claims, these lies. Judge Howell said Friday that Rudy's claims against these two women has caused material harm, and should he repeat these claims one more time, he faces imprisonment. Rudy appeared remotely during Monday's hearing, where he was found in contempt, but he flew to Washington, D.C. to attend yesterday's hearing in person. A thoroughly chastened Rudy Giuliani stepped out of the courtroom yesterday after Judge Howell found Rudy in contempt, and Rudy humbly told reporters, quote, "Judge Howell is bloodthirsty." Rudy tried to win the judge's favor yesterday by telling reporters she was, quote, "dishonest and dishonorable." Then, making his wisest legal argument yet, Rudy told reporters, quote, "I shouldn't be the one in contempt. She should be the one in contempt." Well, how can you argue with that? The man is a legal genius. Rudy asked the judge yesterday to stop making him travel to Washington, D.C. because he claims there are people trying to kill him, like the Iranians. He added he has 2 arteries completely blocked and lung disease from breathing in toxic fumes on 9/11. The judge yesterday asked, "You can't travel anymore to D.C.? That's interesting. Are you coming here for the inauguration?" And Rudy said, "Yeah, but that's different. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." This is what he said. Being sued for, he didn't say this, what I'm about to tell you, but he was thinking, being sued for defamation, that happens all the time. But the guy who put me in this position, who still won't pay me the $3 million in legal fees for the work I did not being able to prove election fraud, that guy, to watch him sworn in as president after all he hasn't done for me, greatest joy of my life. I have to be at the inauguration. This is the mop-up for January 11th, 2025. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for finding me. Please like this episode. That's how I stay in your feed. Subscribe to this channel. And of course, the best way to help is to share this episode with your friends. According to Copernicus Climate Change Service, 2024 turned out to be the hottest year on record. It is now estimated that the world economy suffered $300 billion in damages last year, directly linked to climate catastrophe. There are reports that the Los Angeles fires will create $50 billion in financial losses, making it the most expensive fire ever in American history, some pinning it at $75 billion. No figure yet for how many Los Angeles homeowners lack fire insurance. Reports of people unable to afford fire insurance. We're hearing reports as climate catastrophe has forced companies to jack up their premiums or just refuse to give coverage. We do know as of this morning, about 15% of homeowners in the Pacific Palisades switched to what is called the FAIR plan. That is fire insurance provided by the state of California and not private insurers. More on the Los Angeles fires in a moment. Again, this is climate catastrophe. The incoming administration lacks the vocabulary or even the willingness to deal with climate catastrophe. Climate change will be Trump's COVID. He will fumble the ball once again, the same way he did with COVID. And he's already doing what he does best, the only thing he can do, and that is blame the victims. More on that in a second. America is now the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, right behind China. But since Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, remember Trump pulled us out, Biden put us back into the Paris Climate Accords. Since we rejoined, some progress has been made. For example, coal power usage in America is now the lowest since 1967. That is incredible considering how much larger our country, our economy, and population have all grown. Wind and solar usage here in America last year topped coal for the first time. This started with Obama's 2009 stimulus package. There would be no Tesla, no exponential growth in wind and solar technology with Barack Obama's 2009 stimulus package. Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is the single largest investment in alternative energy in world history. And he just signed an executive order last week that essentially outlaws the sale of new gas-powered cars in 10 years. That is an order that came from Gavin Newsom, but it had to be co-signed by Joe Biden. Even still, U.S. carbon emissions were only down 0.02% for 2024. At least they were down. According to the Paris Accords, however, we're supposed to lower our carbon emissions by 7.6% a year to meet our 2035 goals and not fall off the cliff here. So we were supposed to lower carbon emissions by 7.6%. Last year, we only did it 0.002%. Granted, it did come down. Now, what happened? Why didn't it come down enough? Heat waves last year caused a 3% spike in electricity usage because when there's a heat wave, Americans, we turn on our air conditioners. Transportation emissions came in below our 2019 numbers. That's a 5-year low in greenhouse emissions from trucks, cars, and jets. This despite record road and air travel last year. So we hit a 5-year low in transportation emissions despite record number of people traveling. If he follows through with promises to undo the green provisions inside Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, Donald Trump is expected to add 4 billion tons of greenhouse emissions, meaning the tipping point will happen on his watch. And he will blame everybody but himself. He will blame everybody but himself and the fossil fuel industry. The actor James Woods has spent the final chapter of his life turning into all the creeps he played in the movies. He's one of the greatest actors of all time, but I'm not sure it was actually acting. He delights in trolling people on social media. He broke down in tears on CNN earlier this week describing his evacuation from, I believe it was the Pacific Palisades, and how he expects to lose his home. Well, he loves being on Twitter, and Twitter delighted in his suffering. I looked at the thread, and The Twitter trolls were out and they began asking him, do you still believe climate change is a hoax? And Woods wrote back. He was in a hotel. He thought he had lost his home. He wrote back, quote, this fire is not from climate change, you ignorant a-hole. It's because liberal idiots like you elect liberal idiots like Gavin Newsom, that would be the governor of California, and Karen Bass, that would be the mayor of Los Angeles. James Wood continued, quote, one doesn't understand the first thing about fire management, that would be Gavin Newsom, and the other, that would be Karen Bass, can't fill the water reservoirs. Well, he's wrong. He's wrong. But it's the playbook, blame government, not the fossil fuel companies. I'm a Republican, blame government. Hey, cut my taxes, get rid of government services, and then when something goes wrong, blame government. More on the reservoirs and fire management in a few seconds. I'll show you why James Woods doesn't know what he is talking about. But I have some good news. James Woods, if you look at this picture, James Woods returned to his home, and it's still standing. Look at that. It's literally an apocalyptic hellscape. But if you look, let me go wide here. Can we? Yes. On the right, look at that. His home is still standing amidst this barren wilderness. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Well, that's good news. That's good news. As of this morning, the death toll in Los Angeles now stands at 11. But President Biden says he expects that number to rise as the fire eventually subsides and the search begins for survivors. Very sorry that we've lost 11, and there'll probably be more. But if you saw those fires on television, the fact that it's only 11 speaks volumes to how efficient and effective the Los Angeles Fire Department is and how great a job Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass did. It's a tragedy to lose one person, 11 people, but that is government responding when the number is as low as 11. Again, one is too many. At least 10,000 buildings and homes destroyed. 200,000 remain evacuated throughout Los Angeles. 200,000 acres destroyed throughout Los Angeles. The fire in the Pacific Palisades is only 8% contained. It is now the third worst fire in terms of how much has burned. It's the third worst fire in California history. It started first on January 7th. That would be early Tuesday morning. By that evening, it had destroyed the homes of several celebrities, including Paris Hilton. That fire spread, I believe, to Malibu, where it destroyed the $14 million home of actor Mel Gibson, who was in Texas at the time recording a podcast with Joe Rogan, public intellectual Joe Rogan. Rogan said to Mel Gibson as they were talking about his house being on fire, this is what public intellectual Joe Rogan said, quote, "The wildfire situation, how crazy is it that California spent $24 billion last year on the homeless, and what did they spend on preventing these wildfires? Zip." Joe Rogan is a dangerous, illiterate moron. California didn't spend $24 billion on the homeless last year. The entire state spent $24 billion on the homeless over a 5-year period. That's under $5 billion a year to tackle a problem exacerbated by climate change, which is getting worse, a shortage of homes, which is getting worse, and income inequality, which is getting worse. A little under $5 billion a year, Joe Rogan, on the homeless. Let me help you out here. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. California's GDP last year was $4 trillion. We are talking about a $4 trillion economy, and less than $5 billion of it being spent on the homeless last year. You think that's a waste of money? What happened to you as a child, Joe Rogan? Who hurt you that you would think $5 billion, which isn't enough to tackle homelessness, is a waste of money? Well, it must be so nice to be stupid like Joe Rogan and ill-informed and not have to worry about any of your listeners correcting you. California Governor Gavin Newsom called for an independent investigation looking into why firefighters found themselves at times with little water pressure. Governor Newsom said, quote, "While water supplies from local fire hydrants are not designed to extinguish wildfires over large areas, losing supplies from fire hydrants likely impaired the effort to protect some homes and evacuation corridors," unquote. How's that for responsibility? How's that for accepting some responsibility and calling for an independent investigation? So what happened? Well, there isn't enough water to put out these fires. We do know this morning that the Santa Ynez Reservoir provides water to the Pacific Palisades. There's about 70 billion gallons of water in there when it's full. Unfortunately, the reservoir had been taken offline to do repair work on its cover. Reservoirs are often covered, especially in Los Angeles, to prevent evaporation from the heat and contamination from pollution or algae growth. So that reservoir, through no fault of anybody's, was temporarily offline for general maintenance and could not be turned back on. Donald Trump immediately took to social media and blamed the fires on, quote unquote, Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom. One of the worst tragedies in American history. And he's calling the governor Gavin Newsom. Not going after the oil companies, not blaming it on climate change, blame it on the government. Always blame it on the government unless you're in charge of that government, in which case you would say, it's a once-in-a-100-year fire. Nobody could see this coming. It's not my fault. It's not my... Meanwhile, Republicans are blaming Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, for the devastation because, and I love this, because of budget cuts. Budget cuts, actually, that never happened, but why let the truth get in the way? But imagine that, Republicans blaming the mayor of Los Angeles for budget cuts. She didn't cut the budget to the fire department. It's a lie. Heather Knight from the New York Times reported yesterday that Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, increased spending on the fire department last year by $53 million. She did do battle with the firefighters union over overtime, but it's a lie to claim she cut spending. But lie, because you can't blame these fires on the person really responsible, and that would be Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, no relation to James Woods. Darren Woods. Now, Exxon is being sued by several states, including, most recently, Maine, to recoup financial losses due to climate change. There's no question that this falls on the shoulders of Exxon. The lawsuit, there are many state lawsuits. It's reminiscent of the tobacco lawsuits. The lawsuits allege that Exxon knew they were heating up the planet as far back as the 60s, but suppressed the evidence. So, we could blame Exxon. You could blame the person who's really responsible, But when you take your money from the person responsible, you look for anybody else. They're blaming DEI. They are literally blaming lesbian firefighters. That's anything but Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon. Eventually, he's going to have to pay for this, or at least Exxon is going to have to pay for this. Exxon is doing the new thing now. This is the new thing. They're filing a defamation lawsuit against the state of California, as well as several environmental groups. This is the Donald Trump playbook. You don't sue me, I'm suing you for defamation. Corporations, ExxonMobil, suing for defamation. ExxonMobil filed a defamation lawsuit while these fires were going on this week in California. ExxonMobil filed a defamation lawsuit against California Attorney General Rob Bonta and several environmental groups in response to California suing Exxon back in September. Now, California sued Exxon in September in civil court for falsely claiming that plastic bags are recyclable. This is a thing that Exxon has been selling as part of their greenwashing. They say, plastic is recyclable. California alleges in this lawsuit that Exxon, for decades, engaged in deception and false advertising by pretending to tackle the plastic waste crisis instead of creating it. This is what the lawsuit says. But in the defamation lawsuit Exxon filed against California, Exxon claims you've defamed our reputation, our sterling reputation. They say in the lawsuit you're discrediting Exxon's advanced and innovative recycling technology. California maintains in their lawsuit that most plastics that Exxon insists have been recycled have not been recycled. Exxon, there's more than just gasoline that comes from these petroleum products. Plastic waste. $50 billion in losses. They say it could end up being the most expensive fire ever in United States history. Maybe because the homes are so expensive, especially in the Pacific Palisades. I think the average home in the Pacific Palisades is like $4 million, I think. Well, this is sad. Keith Wasserman is an LA-based real estate millionaire, and he had to deactivate his Twitter account. He took to social media when the fire first broke out. He was asking for private firefighters who could come and protect his home in the Pacific Palisades. And apparently some Twitter users didn't appreciate that. This was his tweet as the fire was breaking out. Quote, "Does anyone have access to private firefighters to protect our home in Pacific Palisades? Need to act fast here. All neighbors' houses burning. Will pay any amount. Thank you," unquote. Well, for some reason, that tweet began trending, and he at first laughed it off. He tweeted, "Hey, Mom, I've gone viral." And then Steve Wasserman from Gelt, I think his real estate company is Gelt, Gelt, he began trending even more on Twitter, so much so that his Twitter account has been deactivated. That's sad. All the man wanted was to get to the front of the line because he has more money than everybody else. 600 California National Guard troops have been deployed to help all first responders. Hey, I'd like a private National Guard battalion to protect my home from looting. We'll pay any amount. Thank you. Police say so far 18 people have been arrested, some charged with looting. Others, Los Angeles police say, of the 18 that have been arrested, some for looting, others charged with illegal drug possession. God bless the LA Police Department. The entire city's on fire, and they still have time to arrest people of color for illegal drug possession. Not drug dealing, illegal drug possession. What a great police force, the LAP. Oh, you shouldn't talk that way about them. They're 800 state prisoners have been deployed as firefighters in California right now. California has been using prisoners to fight fires for decades. Interesting story about this. Now, back in 2011, the United States Supreme Court put California prisons under a consent decree, ruling that prisons in California are so overcrowded they violate the Eighth Amendment's prescription against cruel and unusual punishment. We've done shows about the state of California's prisons. It's as bad as Fulton County. California was reluctant to empty its prisons, with lawyers from the California Attorney General's office putting into writing that early release of nonviolent offenders would deplete California's prison labor system, which relies on low-cost workers, slaves, prison labor, and they added, they didn't call it, they didn't say slaves, but low-cost workers, these are slaves. That's unfair to the people who were actually slaves. So, but it's the loophole in the 13th Amendment. So they wrote a letter to the Supreme Court and said, we can't let these nonviolent prisoners out because it would deplete our prison labor system. These are low-cost workers as well as firefighters. We have free firefighters. We need these prisoners. So a lot of people perceive that memo written by lawyers from the California State Attorney General's office, a lot of people perceive that to suggest that California's Attorney General cared more about free labor than improving living conditions inside her state's prisons. Yes, I said her because the Attorney General at the time was Kamala Harris, who said while running for president in 2020, when she was asked about that, she said she had no idea her office had made that argument. Not going to pile on Kamala Harris. I did it back in 2019. Go back and listen to my shows from 2019. I'm moving on past, I voted for her. I got on board. Moving on. Now, until 2020, California prisoners who worked as firefighters, as inmates, they could not become professional firefighters upon their release. So the lie is, hey, we've got these prisoners fighting fires, but we're rehabilitating them and training them and teaching them a skill and a profession so when they get out of prison, they can become professional firefighters. Well, until 2020, and still, really, no, they can't become professional firefighters. See, in order to become a firefighter, you need a certificate as an emergency medical technician, an EMT. So you need to learn how to fight fires, but you also need a certificate as an emergency medical technician, an EMT. Ever notice when you think you're having a heart attack and you call 911, instead of sending a doctor, they send a firefighter who takes your blood pressure and convinces you it's gas? They don't send a nurse. They don't send a doctor. They send a firefighter. Maybe if I have heartburn, I need but you have to be certified as an EMT if you want to fight fires. So in California, you couldn't get an EMT certificate if you had a prison record. They never told us that when they said prisoners were fighting fires. They assured us, no. Once they get out, they'll be qualified to become professional firefighters. But they didn't tell us they can't be firefighters because they can't qualify for an EMT certificate. So they passed a new law in 2020 allowing some prisoners who worked as firefighters, as behind bars, they can qualify for an EMT certificate if they serve time for a nonviolent offense. If they had a stellar record behind prison, then they can qualify for an EMT certificate. I doubt it makes a dent. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but from what I've read, a lot of these prisoners who are released, who were firefighters, still have difficulty getting hired as professional firefighters. This is the mop-up for January 11th, 2025. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for finding me. Please like this episode so I remain in your feed. There are a lot of shows out there, and the algorithm they call it? Yes, the algorithm. So if you like the show, it helps if you... what did I just say? I don't even know. I'm not even thinking as I say this stuff. It's stuff I've been, like it, subscribe, and tie your shoelaces. The employment numbers came out Friday, and the U.S. economy added 250,000 new jobs in December. Taking a victory lap, President Biden said, quote, "Although I inherited the worst economic crisis in decades with unemployment above 6%, when I took office, we've had the lowest average unemployment rate of any administration in 50 years, with unemployment now at 4.1% as I leave." He will say goodbye Wednesday night from the Oval Office. Stocks slid after the jobs report. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the day down 1.4%, the S&P 500 off 1.7%. Tech-heavy NASDAQ slipped by 2.2%. Why? The jobs report was great. Well, Wall Street sees Americans working, and then they fear increased labor costs, and they think inflation. Americans working has nothing to do with inflation. They see job growth, and they fear an overheated economy, and they fear an overheated economy results in inflation. If we've learned anything during the past 4 years, inflation has nothing to do with fiscal spending. Nothing to do with fiscal spending. But the Fed, they have to respond because they're being paid, so they see the jobs numbers, and they see low unemployment, so they keep interest rates high, claiming, well, we have to keep inflation at bay, when in fact they want to keep interest rates high because high interest rates mean more money for the bankers and, of course, the people who lend money. They want high interest rates. So the Fed is looking for any excuse not to lower interest rates. Wall Street, however, loves cheap money. The banks not so much. Donald Trump is officially a convicted felon. He becomes the first president in American history to be a convicted felon, the first president in American history ever to take office as a convicted felon. We elected, it's official, the American people, if you believe the numbers, and I do, elected a convicted felon. Judge Juan Merchan on Friday did what I told you he was going to do, and that is issue what is called an unconditional discharge in that Manhattan hush money case where a jury found Trump guilty. on 34 felony counts for trying to hide hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels. That was in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. So he did this before he was president. He reimbursed Michael Cohen for the payments when he was in the Oval Office, but that is not an official act as president. It doesn't fall under the penumbra, as they say, of official acts as president. So who knows with this Supreme Court? An unconditional discharge means Trump avoids jail time. He could have been sentenced to as much as 4 years in prison, but that was never going to happen, no matter who the defendant was, so long as the defendant was white. They're not going to put a white guy in prison for the crimes Donald Trump committed. If he were MSNBC anchor Carlos Watson, you lock him up for 10 years because Carlos is black. That's the way it works in America. Look up what's happening to Carlos Watson. Anyway, an unconditional discharge means Trump remains a convicted felon. This will not be expunged from his record unless he wins on appeal. Judge Juan Merchan, in issuing the sentencing, said as far as he is concerned, as far as this court is concerned, the unconditional discharge means this entire case is done. No jail, no community service, nothing other than the record officially showing that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Trump took to social media immediately after, and he called the whole thing, quote, a radical Democrat witch hunt. He did appear remotely for the sentencing, telling the judge this is all one big political persecution because Trump is innocent. Trump is innocent. He told Judge Juan Merchan, I'm innocent and the American people know I'm innocent. That's why I won in November. Sitting beside Trump yesterday was his attorney, Todd Blanche, who Trump has nominated to serve as Deputy Attorney General. Todd Blanche was a George W. Bush appointee who served as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York for 8 years. He was a registered Democrat until last year. And he has to go through the nomination process, but Trump wants him to become Deputy Attorney General. Kiss your law license goodbye, Todd. Trump, of course, will appeal this decision all the way up to the New York State Supreme Court. There is no guarantee that the United States Supreme Court will take this case. There has to be, theoretically, you never know with this court, there has to be some constitutional issue at play here. On face value, there doesn't seem to be. Perhaps this Supreme Court would take the case to determine whether ex-presidents can be tried for crimes they committed while running for president. Maybe people running for president have some kind of immunity that this court can create. Again, the hush money was paid before Trump was elected in 2016. It doesn't fall under the category of official acts as president. I think Trump's going to have a hard time convincing the Supreme Court this goes beyond the state. They've surprised me in the past, but most telling was Thursday's decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 that the sentencing on Friday could take place. So they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, stopped the sentencing. The court said no. Joining the liberal majority was Judge Amy Coney Barrett. She's a Trump nominee. Also joining the liberals was Chief Justice John Roberts, who authored last July's 6-3 ruling that granted Trump limited immunity in both the election interference and the classified documents case. Both those cases have pretty much gone dark since Trump won the election and special counsel Jack Smith quit instead of allowing Trump to fire him. I don't understand why Christopher Wray quit as head of the FBI and why special counsel Jack Smith quit instead of forcing Trump to fire him. But Smith has a 2-volume report that he's prepared on the election interference and the classified document cases, and they were scheduled for release until Judge Eileen Cannon, the Trump appointee who tossed out the classified documents case. Eileen Cannon also issued a ruling blocking the release of Jack Smith's 2 reports. This is now being batted around inside the courts. An appeals court ruled this week that Smith could release his report on election interference, but not the report on the classified documents case. Attorney General Merrick Garland says he's planning to just release the election interference report sometime before Joe Biden leaves office. Now, I'm going to assume Trump has already filed for an emergency hearing before the Supreme Court. But if he hasn't, we could see the report on election interference released as early as Monday. As for the classified documents report, Attorney General Merrick Garland said he doesn't want that to go public because while the case against Trump has gone dark, the classified documents case has gone dark, the case against his valet, Walt Nauta, and a former Mar-a-Lago property manager, Carlos de Oliveira, they're both charged with obstruction of justice, that has not yet been resolved. Garland said releasing the classified documents volume could prejudice a potential jury. So Jack Smith has 2 volumes. One volume is about the election interference trial. The second volume is about the classified documents. Donald Trump was the only person indicted in the election interference trial. There were unindicted co-conspirators. They were waiting to first take Trump to trial and then go after the unindicted co-conspirators, but that case is just done. The classified documents case, which has been thrown out by Eileen Cannon, it's still not resolved because there are 2 other defendants, the property manager at Mar-a-Lago, Carlos de Oliveira, and Walt Nauta, Trump's valet. They're charged with obstruction of justice, and that doesn't seem to have been resolved yet. Back to the Manhattan criminal trial, the conviction, which stands. It's important to remember the Supreme Court will probably not take this on appeal. And Trump can't pardon himself out of this conviction once he becomes president. Presidential pardon power only extends to federal cases. So this is going to be stuck around his neck. And the same applies to the RICO trial brought forth by Fulton County, Georgia District Attorney Fani Willis, who charged Trump and 18 co-defendants with running a criminal enterprise when they attempted to overturn the 2020 presidential election in the state of Georgia. 4 defendants have already pled guilty in this RICO trial, including 3 attorneys, Kenneth Cheesebro, Jenna Ellis, and Sidney Powell, and a bail bondsman, the 4th. Three attorneys have already pled guilty. On December 19th of last year, the Georgia Court of Appeals ruled that Madam DA, Fani Willis, as well as the entire Fulton County Prosecutor's Office, could not try this case due to what the appeals court called an appearance of impropriety because Fani Willis allegedly had an improper relationship with the lead prosecutor. Just complete horseshit. On Friday, Fani Willis announced she will appeal that ruling before the Georgia Supreme Court. The fight continues. We are 9 days away from Trump resoiling the Oval Office. There are people who are fighting. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you for listening. Please share this. Please like this. Thank you to Bob in the chat room and Mila in the chat room. I understand Mila is okay. She lives in California, but the smoke, she has to keep the windows shut. This is the fault of ExxonMobil. When you look at what's going on, it's not the fault of the mayor of LA. It's not Gavin Newsom's fault. It is the fault of ExxonMobil, and they should pay for this. I don't know if I'm going to do a show tomorrow. I have a lot of stuff to go over, so I don't know. I wish I could tell you. I have to see what's on my plate. Thank you so much for listening to this garbage.